This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal. Today we are having a memorial tribute to John Lennon, who died 42 years ago on the 8th of December in 1980 at the age of 40. A typical synopsis of his life could be found online, as in the case of biography.com, John Lennon biography, which will give you the summary. The common belief about John Lennon's life and death in capsule summary as followed. Pop star, composer, and songwriter John Lennon was born October 9, 1940 in Liverpool, England. Lennon met McCartney in 1957 and invited Paul to join his music group. They eventually formed the most successful songwriting partnership in musical history. Lennon left the Beatles in 1969 and later released albums with his wife Yoko Ono and others. In 1980, he was killed by a crazed fan. Now, that's the common knowledge, the common belief. 99 out of 100 would endorse that summary. Much of what we're going to talk about is whether or not that final second sentence in 1980 was killed by a crazed fan is or is not true. Here to begin with the first hour, to give us background about John and some aspects about the shooting, is Clare Kuehn from Canada. Clare, welcome to The Real Deal.
Hi, Jim from the U.S.
Yes, yes.
It was 32 years. You misspoke, not 40, because you were about to say 1940. 32 years ago, on Saturday, this week it's a Saturday, December 8th, as the observance.
Yes, from 1980 to 2012 is indeed 32 years. Correct, Claire. Thank you. I was combining his age at 40 with the number of years. You got it right. Thank you. Please continue.
Well, I'm glad we're doing this. One of the things that really bugs me about this is that this is so undercovered. It's under commented upon, this death. It was a major shift where deaths of we could say them popular culture people, but they're artists. Death of artists, death of media artists came into the spotlight as possible government, or again, I don't mean the average government, but cabals within government caused deaths. There were others in the past that probably were. We know of several, but John's was a major one, and to this day, in picture books of the Beatles, or of his life, I noticed that the photographs they choose to show include a photograph of the Dakota building. It was called the Dakota because it was outside of the main area in the 1880s when it was built. It was outside of the main area in New York City where all the rich people would be, and it was built to be this, so it was seen as you're over in the Dakotas, okay, so it's called the Dakota. And it's a big fortress-like building down by Central Park. The photograph that they choose to show about the assassination is a photograph of the side of the building with a big poster on it. And the poster says Mark David Chapman, who's the accused killer, was a mind control agent, and it was a poster that someone had put up on the side of the Dakota right after the killing, and it outlined. You can see the writing on it, and I think that the people putting together these books are trying to tell you that they actually endorse that position, because you would think they'd choose all kinds of other photographs if they didn't think so. So it's interesting. I've looked at 3 or 4 picture books of John Lennon's life and death, and they almost always include that photograph, which includes that poster. So we're going to talk about Mark David Chapman and about where people were standing and about motives and stuff, which Total will get into in the second hour with you. I have to cover a little bit of it in order to begin the conversation, if that's okay.
Yeah, that would be great. Please do.
Well, this would be a bit of a repeat for you, Jim, but the thing is, John Lennon was portrayed as a sort of, by some, as a commie lefty or pinko weirdo by some people. And actually in those days, and to some degree today, anyone who supports the rights of labor to organize, or people of different stripes and ilks to get out there and say, we have needs, or we want to join with other people, similar needs, they're quote-unquote anti-establishment, they're trying to get the country back on track. Those people are often portrayed as Marxists. As a matter of fact, some of them even will call themselves Marxists because of a mistake in not understanding literal Marxism and actually trying to say, well, because Marx was a big economist who talked about labor rights and women's rights and so on, therefore we're Marxists. It's a bit of a mistake. But anyway, but he wasn't sitting there, being a rabid totalitarian or something. He's trying to help people. He got out on marches for years before he'd been talking about, before the 70s, he was already questioning Kennedy's death in subtle ways. He knew things were going on. He was a big reader. He was not always the nicest guy to be around, but he had a great heart. So this led John to be a person who ultimately was concerned about such issues. His wife, Yoko Ono, was as well. She's an interesting personality. She has her problems, but she is interested in these social justice issues, or was. And John particularly was. So they got involved in the very late 60s and early 70s in a lot of causes. And then, as Total will probably go into, he had an immigration, he was trying to immigrate to the U.S. They had used a marijuana conviction, which actually, ironically, for all the drugs they were doing, that one was a set-up job by a cop who was later actually put in jail for trying to plant things on people. He was trying to get all the stars. He was sort of a rabid anti-druggy, anti-pinko commie star kind of guy. He's a cop of that ilk, and he was planting things. So this conviction, which he had for a false planted piece of marijuana or whatever, that's sheesh, ended up causing a problem when he later tried to immigrate to the U.S. And it probably wouldn't have been used that way except for what his statements were about anti-war, and he was actually anti-war, not just anti-Vietnam War. So the movie out about that stuff is the U.S. versus John Lennon. It's a wonderful documentary. It came, 5-6 years ago. And it also covers the fact that in the FBI files there were mention of CIA documents that aren't in the CIA package when they got the CIA package. And then there are references in the CIA documents to things that are much after the FBI documents stop as well. So in other words, we know that the packages that came from the Freedom of Information Act request do not include a lot of documents, and probably he was being tailed long after. He was called a paranoiac because he had done drugs, but he and Yoko had a lot of clicks on their phone. They had a lot of people tailing them. Other people began to witness this, so he wasn't making it up, and that came out years later. So that's a context for probably why the hit was done if it wasn't just a crazed fan. That's sort of my little summary on that, because otherwise we can't get to the physical evidence as quickly.
Well, wouldn't we normally work it the other way around, most crimes are solved by working outward from the physical evidence, especially the autopsy report and the cause of death, and then the circumstances of the crime scene to figure out, reason backwards to motive, means, and opportunity as to who would have, wanted to bring about the death of this individual.
Of course you would. We have, but the audience is in a different position, which is, why are we even discussing this? So I wanted to put it out there to give them a context into which they might be willing to listen to the crime scene evidence. Otherwise, it can sound like just combing through crime scene evidence and having no context for it. So that's why I was mentioning that.
Well, there are a number of aspects here. I mean, it looks as though, you're alluding to the CIA. Richard Nixon appears to have been rather paranoid about John Lennon. And from, even the same John Lennon biography, it offers a a paragraph about Lenin and Ono moved to the U.S. in September 1971, but were constantly threatened with deportation by the Nixon administration. Lenin was told he was being kicked out of the country because of his 1968 marijuana conviction in Britain, but Lenin believed the true reason was his activism against the unpopular Vietnam War. Documents later proved him correct. 2 years after Nixon resigned, Lenin was granted permanent U.S. residency in 1976. But that's after, so his death followed, after 4 years, basically, after Nixon's resignation. So since we had, Nixon followed by Gerald Ford for just 2 years, his death occurred in the Ronald Reagan administration.
Well, Ronald Reagan hadn't been sworn in yet. That's another thing. 3 months later, John Hinckley Jr. would be accused and put away for attempting on Reagan's life just after Reagan had been made president. So this seems to be, as Total has said, a situation in which the Bush regime, and you've done work on the Kennedy assassination and the connection of Bush to that, that the Bush regime and the CIA, plus Hoover's stuff, Hoover's apparatus. Hoover was very against anyone who seemed to be so-called causing problems for the police. It's a wrong idea of policing, but anyway, is it causing problems for the establishment if they spoke out to correct the society? So there were several groups who were against him, but Nixon was personally interested in the Lenin case. We have documents that show that, but it wasn't just originating with Nixon and over when Nixon was gone, and that's my point. The Bush regime was, as Total has said it elsewhere, pushing to get onto Reagan's ticket, political ticket, and when Reagan got in, there was as you may know, a drill for what is it called? Where someone accedes to the presidency because of a death. So they actually did a drill for swearing in the Vice President George Bush. I think it was a few days before the attempted assassination on Reagan. So they were preparing for Reagan's death. It was probably an attempted coup from the Bush group and the CIA group to get Reagan out. So like get on his ticket, then get him dead, then take over. So it seems to be that cabal, not so much Reagan personally, who were orchestrating, if it wasn't Chapman alone, who were orchestrating Lenin's death, because they had a lot of things planned for the Bush and Reagan administration that they knew that Lenin would be all over, and he could marshal. He'd been out of singing commission for a while. He'd stayed low through most of the 70s, and he had come back. And if he had come back and started to act politically, they couldn't have gotten through a lot of what they wanted to. He could have just spoken out, and thousands would have been right with him. It's sort of like if you had that kind of a following and we were all aware and Jim said, hey, everybody go here, we got to fight this. We'd all be out there because we all understand what you're talking about. But when he was killed, that activism, that focal point was gone. So that's why I was covering it. It's good that you mentioned.
The idea that Bush forced himself onto the Reagan ticket, or that Reagan was forced to take Bush on the ticket, is very striking, because we know that Lyndon Johnson, using information provided to him by J. Edgar Hoover, was able to force himself onto the JFK ticket. When Bobby came to extend a pro forma invitation, Jack had already actually invited Stuart Symington of Missouri to run with him and given him overnight to think about it. But when Bobby extended the gesture to Lyndon, he jumped on it. And when they tried to work their way out of it, he threatened to expose that among JFK's liaisons had been one with a beautiful woman who turned out to be an East German spy, reveal that in terms of his health, he had Addison's disease and wasn't expected to live a long life, and moreover, that as majority leader, if he were not on the ticket, that he'd ensure that any legislation sent down from the White House, any proposals, would be dead on arrival, where Jack and Bobby tried to figure a way out of this, but were unable to do so, and eventually concluded that they the whole story would never be known to the public, and it was probably just as well. This is all very troubling, of course, because Lennon was setting himself up to accede to the higher office when JFK was taken out, and it's very, very disturbing, the idea that Bush was being put in a parallel position. My assessment of Ronald Reagan, Claire, would be that he was a very decent guy. I don't think he would have ever contemplated murdering anyone, assassinating anyone for political motives or otherwise. That's my take on the man. He seems to me to have been a pretty decent guy. Maybe not the greatest president, though he inspired many because of his trickle-down economics and all that, but that was the way in which his presidency was used to benefit the wealthy in this country by massive tax cuts and the like.
Well, Reagan, I think personally, was not as much of a killer plotter, but he, as governor of California, there's a lot that people should know what he did do and what he arranged for, and possible deaths and things. So
fill us in, Claire. I'd be glad to know more about that.
Well, I think we should get back to Lenin. People can go and learn about Reagan. They can learn, and I'm saying he's not an LBJ, and he's not a George Bush, but he was not an all nice guy. I think what he was, yeah. Lenin. So anyway, Lenin had been for years speaking out about things. He was involved with people such as Abby Hoffman and others. Some people suggested that Abby Hoffman was an agent, whether or not he was, or whether or not he was, well, whatever he was. There was in fact a concert planned to go down to the Republican National Convention. I think it was in Florida at the time, to actually have a big concert there against the war. This was planned. Many people say that was just a rumor, because Lenin and Ono later denied it massively and then kind of went out of the public eye. What happened was they were planning this. They were, by then, Lenin was very much into really fighting this war. He was not as much of a hot to trot radical, but he was a dedicated anti-war person, and the evidence for this comes out in a man named Goldman's book. And a lot of people slam Goldman's book because there's a lot of negative stuff that comes out about John in that book. If you read it for real, you'll find that it's extremely well researched. He interviewed 1,000 people. I mean, he really did his research well. Unfortunately, his editorializing about John tends towards the negative. So though he puts positive and negative in the content, his editorializing focuses on the negative, which is already shocking enough, the material, but then he goes further, and that's where, reading it, you have to filter out that a bit. But there's a lot of negatives about John, a lot of positives, but he's got a beautiful heart. And one of the things is a section on the Abby Hoffman and the Black Panthers and what was going on, and John's involvement in that, and many witnesses to the fact that they were planning this concert. So John Lennon had moved with Yoko Ono to this big fortress-like building called the Dakota in New York City, near Hyde Park. Near what's it called? Near Central, not near Central Park, is it? Is it near Central? It's near Central Park.
Yeah, Central Park.
Yeah, and that building, they lived there for many years. They had their phones tapped. He was followed. People called him paranoid, but it was proven later that, in fact, this had gone on. And we have the documents, but also other witnesses. So then he ends up dead near midnight on December 8th, New York City time, and in 1980. And this is a strange thing, because it turns out that the accused assassin, Mark David Chapman, was standing there all day, had been outside the Dakota, had gotten he actually got his photo taken with John by a photographer who was hanging out there. Very convenient, whether that photographer was or wasn't also involved in the operation somehow or asked to be there to make sure there was this nice photo op. John signing his recent album, his first album in years, for Mark David Chapman. And Mark David Chapman actually though as a kid he listened to Meet the Beatles, which is his one record or something. For years after, he was not a Beatles fan, and there were claims that he had become this rabid Beatles fan. But in fact, his favorite group was a group that was antithesis of the Beatles. I forget which group it was, but he was a real fan of this other group. Mark David Chapman had moved from Georgia. He moved around. He'd worked with YMCA and World Vision. He was picked up through those circles because the YMCA, as you know, at the time was a way for young people, young men particularly, to have a place to stay, to find friends. But he was very, very, very afraid of homosexuals and very against them. He may have had some trauma from some of them because this is one of his obsessions. And it was also, as you know, a hotbed for homosexual activity So Mark David Chapman was traveling around the world. We do have a spy who came out, I think it was in the 80s, forgetting his name, CIA guy, who wrote, and one of the things that he wrote about was this fact that that in some locations, the YMCA offices were the front for the CIA activities. They had a few people in there who were using that as their place to stay, or that was where they met people. So they're kind of running little things through that. And World Vision, as Total has mentioned, was partly founded by one of the leaders of it was Hinckley Sr., who was the father of Hinckley Jr., who was the supposed assassin attempt on Reagan. So it seems as though these crimes are linked. Plus, Hinckley Jr. claimed that he was doing a copycat murder. He was using Catcher in the Rye. He wanted to model himself on Mark David Chapman, and this is only 3 months after Chapman had killed Lennon, so there is that direct connection too. Chapman was a disturbed young man. He was not he was not always crazy. He was not running around being crazy. He was known for being a nice kid, but he was probably a severe trauma victim. He did, in fact, have some hallucinations, some pictures, talk to himself. He called them the little people or whatever. He kind of talked to himself, And he was a depressive. He was in and out of care for depression, and at one point, I think, suicidal thoughts or attempts. So at any point, someone could have gotten to him through that for mind control.
Let me ask you this, Claire. Do you, in fact, then believe that Mark David Chapman was the shooter who killed John Lennon? Because you've several times referred to him as having killed him, having shot him, whatever, or after he had killed him. And I'm wondering whether, you really intend to say that, or rather that he is the alleged shooter, since it's possible that another person actually killed John.
I've actually said alleged as well. I'm going to treat him as alleged, but yeah. I'm going through the case as they make it, right?
Yeah.
So Mark David Chapman.
Well, maybe this is a good time to take our break. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal we're doing a special memorial to John Lennon, who died on December 8th, 1980 at the age of 40 years of age. This is Clare Kuehn, the first hour, Total Info, my producer, the second. We'll be right back.
Even Bush admits that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. Our own FBI acknowledged it has no hard evidence that ties Osama bin Laden to 9/11. But if Saddam had nothing to do with 9/11, and if Osama had nothing to do with 9/11, then who did it? The 9/11 conspiracy provides the answer. Discover the big picture. Learn what we know now. Find out what it means. 11 experts contribute to exposing the truth as the anatomy of an atrocity. Edited by James H. Fetzer. Buy it now if you have the courage to face the truth. Just don't think you're going to like it. The 9/11 conspiracy provides the answer.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, continuing our tribute to the memory of John Lennon, who died on 8 December 1980. Claire, please do continue.
Okay, so So I mentioned a few things about the YMCA and World Vision. There's very little information left about World Vision on the internet. Most of the sites are down, maybe censored. There is a John Judge November 2000 interview which mentions this stuff, and also you can go to macwhite.com, and he has stuff about it, but a lot of those links are now dead. So people should look into this. So anyway, Chapman was accused of being a killer because Chapman was there all day, the day that Lennon
in front of the
shot.
Dakota, all day in front of the Dakota.
In front of the Dakota, and the Dakota has the entrance is funny. It's not a street entrance. It's actually an archway that extends back. So it's a long Roman arch, sort of like a tubular entryway. And at the front is a gate, and at the back is a gate. And it's about 40 to 50 feet, I think, from the front gate into the back, which is a center courtyard. The entrance into the building is near the gate that's into the courtyard on your right side if you're entering. So you go forward about 30 or 40 feet and turn right, and there's this archway into the building. And that's where he stepped up the steps after he'd been shot. Directly across from that is a service elevator archway, which will come into this. The guard booth, the place where the armed security guard stands, if you're standing at the front part of the front gate, it's to your left in front of the gate. So it's sort of beside the gate on your left. So there's a front gate and something in front of you way back 40, 50 feet is a back gate into the courtyard. On your right side is an archway near that back gate, which is the doorways to the inner doorman, and on your left is a service elevator archway and doorway. Now Chapman was standing, of course, as part of the public. He's standing outside. He's standing in front of the front gate, talking to the doorman who was stationed there on your left. So he was standing more on your right, and he was standing there all day, and he was talking to this doorman. It's not the same thing as the front security personnel inside the building. And he was standing and talking about them, and it was reported that he was talking all day about, well, on and off with this doorman, about the CIA, the death of Kennedy, and the Bay of Pigs disaster. And for years, the name of the doorman was not known. It was not reported. It was always doorman. In fact, there were several reports that seems to have tried to confuse the front security guard with the inner security desk guard, because they kept referring to the doorman and they used the wrong name for him and all this. But actually, the front doorman, it's now known, 7 years later, it came out in an article that his name was Jose Perdomo. And so
that sounds like a Cuban name.
Yeah, it is.
And if Chapman's talking to him about the Bay of Pigs and all that, it could be something that is of keen interest to Perdomo. And if Chapman is under some kind of mind control or whatever, but this may be all things you want to get into, Claire. But let me just make one point clear. Even though Mark David Chapman worked as a security guard, he wasn't there at the Dakota in the role of a security guard, correct?
No. He was like, a lightweight. He was a small. He actually hated guns. He was afraid of guns. Ironically, he had a friend who was in the police force. I don't know if it was in Georgia, but it was in one of his original locations, not in Hawaii where he originally moved to. He got the hollow point bullets specifically from that guy. That guy was a sort of a big, brutish kind of guy.
Back up a sec, Claire. Who got hollow point? Mark David Chapman got hollow point bullets?
Right, from this policeman who was his YMCA and police friend, who may very well have been the handler or the tough guy. Chapman was very afraid of guns when he saw guns in the back of the
What in God's name is he doing with hollow point bullets if he doesn't care about guns? If he's apprehensive about guns, that's very odd.
Right, I know. This guy got him these. The story is very strange. Okay, so the fellow who is this police guy gets him hollow point bullets because Chapman says, "Oh, I just want to do some shooting," but Chapman didn't like hanging around guns. See, so they
So
would
what?
go
So
shooting.
he'd be most unlikely to be wanting to do some shooting. I mean,
No,
presumably meaning target practice, right?
Yes, he did. Yeah, he said that, and then this guy got him hollow point bullets. Okay, so you have to read about this in more detail in Bressler's book about the assassination. It's the
Claire,
only
I just
one.
want to talk about this a minute. Okay, number one, you got this guy who's somehow associated with or works at the YMCA, and who may even be Chapman's handler, and he gets some hollow point bullets for a guy who's wary of guns. I mean, if you're going to do target shooting, hollow point bullets would be a very odd choice. I mean, they're a very specialized kind, more expensive form of ammunition. And for a guy who doesn't like guns to even be shooting at all. In other words, all this sounds like an elaborate cover story. Very strange.
Right. Well, Chapman did know how to shoot. He was trained when he was working with, I don't know if it was with World Vision or whatever. He was for a while in Lebanon or something for World Vision right when the war was going on. And the fellow who was working there stayed on for years. It may very well be that was a front. That was So there's all this stuff I'm trying to go through real quickly. It's in Bressler's book. He's a lawyer from the UK, from England, who took an interest in the Lennon case and actually did interview people who had never been interviewed even by the police. He tried to get a hold of, he traces all kinds of stuff. So I'm going to go real fast through this. Sorry, people. But, so anyway, Chapman has these hollow point bullets. He seems to have actually gotten a gun and then possibly thrown it into the ocean, decided he didn't want to kill Lennon, and then he goes back, possibly with another gun, to New York City, but he goes through up into, I think, the Chicago region to visit his grandmother first, then comes down, and he was fighting his whole time, this instinct to kill John Lennon. That's what he kept saying. I didn't really want to do it. Oh, if, he signed my album, and, this was nice. Oh, but then suddenly I hear this voice saying, do it, do it, do it, I'm going to do it. So if he was a mind control victim, he was fighting the impulses. Now,
could he have been subjected to hypnosis?
Absolutely, yeah. He was in care, different care. Some of them seem to have been quite legitimate, and some of them maybe not.
You mean he was under the care of psychiatrists?
That's right, because he was a depressive and he'd had these suicidal impulses, and some of them seem to have helped him, and some of them may not have been helpful. They may have been psychiatrists, right? So. Anyway, he goes up to visit his grandmother and then goes down to New York City supposedly to kill Lennon. But the problem is that the ticket stub, which was actually would have a dual ticket portion and would say that on it, he had made a sort of almost like a mosaic, a panorama of things, his tickets and memorabilia the night he killed John Lennon or the night before. He left it in his hotel room like a kind of almost like the 9/11 hijackers have their perfect Quran sitting there. Well, he's got this thing that he's done, in tribute to himself, supposedly. And there's a photograph of it, but the photograph has a doctored ticket. The ticket does not show the portion of his actually going to his grandmother's. It's not a dual ticket.
Well, that's a very serious point, Claire.
I know. And other than the places where people are standing, I think that is the key thing that Bressler puts in his book. But unfortunately, it gets buried in all the other stuff he's trying to say about this killing.
This is like this woman, Priscilla McMillan Johnson, who was babysitting Maria Oswald.
Right.
And where the FBI had been through his home a couple of times without finding this bus ticket that Lee had allegedly had from traveling to Mexico City, and then she turns it up. And of course, she is the one who is designated to escort Svetlana, Stalin's daughter, when she defects to the United States. In other words, this is a very high-ranking CIA person. There's just a parallel here that's very disturbing. Anything messing with tickets, documents that are fabricated or faked?
That's right. So that's one indication. Plus the hollow point bullets is very strange, plus the fact that he was fighting this impulse. Now, so he gets to the Dakota, and he hangs out all day with this Jose Perdomo, whose name we don't learn for 7 years, and where There was much confusion as to doorman, doorwayman, all this stuff. It was all very confusing.
But Claire, there's all this confusion, but we're only talking about two people, for God's sake. We're only talking about two locations. I mean, the police at the very least should have a diagram and be able to identify two, or when you throw in Chapman, three people. You got two guards, you got an inner guard, an outer guard, and you got Chapman. I mean, how difficult is that for any responsible detective to diagram?
Well, I'm getting to that. So these are not police diagrams. These are reports in the news. There was almost nothing given by the police. Chapman, of course, pled guilty. He was allowed visits by people, including psychiatrists and who knows what.
But did his lawyer initially actually try to make a claim for an insanity defense, but then Chapman subsequently rejected it himself and pled guilty?
Yeah, he changed the defense, and so that precluded having a trial, so nothing came out, and several of the police were very upset about that. The head of the police department in New York City said to Bressler that he would have loved to have found a conspiracy, but, this was easy because this guy had confessed. And so we did our best, but then Bressler and Goldman found that most of the people they interviewed had never been interviewed by the police or had been interviewed so briefly that it was useless. So
a perfunctory investigation by the police suggesting a cover-up, of course.
Right. So we know this through other sources, you see. We don't know it directly from police records because all of those are sealed because the trial didn't happen. So Chapman gets there. He's talking to this Perdomo guy all day, hanging around outside. Gets his album signed. There's a photographer there who takes the picture very conveniently. Whether the guy was sent there unknowingly, or whether it was just a nice coincidence, or whether he was an agent.
You mean he's taking a photograph of John Lennon's sign shortly before he's assassinated?
Right, a couple of hours. John and Yoko then go to the power plant to record some stuff. This is a recording studio. They're there quite late. They get back alone in their limo, and the usual story is Ono is ahead of John. She's inside the door on the end of the long archway alcove thing to your right. She's gone up the stairs. John is behind her. Chapman, it's often reported, dropped into a combat stance, though there is no corroborating evidence from that by Chapman. Chapman says he doesn't remember actually pointing the gun, but he remembers. But he says, and then I pulled the trigger 5 times, which also could have been that he was told that, or he figured he did that. It's supposedly at 4 or 5 foot range to Lennon's right. Lennon walks sort of kitty corner.
To the side of Lennon.
To the right side of Lennon, but he was hit all on the left side through and through.
And if you're being shot at from the right side, it might be very likely you'd have bullets in your arm or your shoulder.
Right, but they were all on the left side of Lennon, okay? Then it was discovered that there were bullet holes in the doorway, which was sticking out. Actually, I should back up here, okay? So Perdomo's on the left and Chapman's on the right. Ono's supposedly on the inside, and most people don't know that there was a handyman and or elevator guy who was present, which the first police on the scene suspected as the murderer. And they actually said, did this guy do it? And it was Perdomo who pointed to Chapman and said, no, this was the shooter. And Chapman said, yes, I am the shooter. He's just standing there reading his book. And then they take Chapman.
Well, it sounds as though he's completely under hypnosis.
Right. The police. Well, I'm trying not to say what what.
Trying not to infer the explanation, but I mean, the gross behavior is very suggestive.
The police themselves. One of the police said he looked like he was under the influence of something.
Yeah.
Now, so Perdomo is the accuser of Chapman. The other guy was suspected. Most people don't know about the other guy. We have no name for him.
You don't even have a name for him?
We don't have a name for him.
This is the Gardner type? The Gardner type?
This is the
workman?
Handyman, workman,
workman. That could the miscellaneous description and all that.
Even the fellow who has come out and suspected Perdomo as the shooter doesn't make much of the handyman. I have a feeling, and I'm going to talk about Perdomo in a minute, but I have a feeling that Perdomo was there to watch the operation and that the handyman was the shooter, because we have no record of who he was at all. In fact, he's usually not even mentioned. But we know that the police guy who suspected the handyman was not confusing him with the doorman guard Perdomo, because he says, and then the doorman said, no, it was Chapman. See, so we know that there was this third guy there. We also have a report that, and there were no other witnesses, okay, except that there was supposedly 3 or 4 guys who had come up in a taxi cab. It's mentioned once, to come up in a taxi cab, watched it, and sped away. We have no record that the police ever traced that cab, ever followed that up, and usually it's not mentioned as part of the
They drove up and watched the assassination?
Well, that they were there, saw it, and sped off. We have no other mention of this fact.
Well, this is very much, this is reminding me very much of Mary's Mosaic by Peter Janney, where he talks about the death of Mary Myers, how the CIA set it up, and they have all the walkers and the passers-by, and they arrange to have a witness.
Yeah. So the only official witnesses in most, if you read most accounts, are other people, such as Sean Strubb, and other people who were standing about 40 or 50 feet away, heard it, and then were interviewed on the news. And actually, of the 14 or 15 people who were around and heard it, only, I think, about 5 of them ended up being on the news. And there's a whole thing about all this on jfkmontreal.com. Okay? That's where most of the best research, other than Bressler's book, is. It's online at JFK.
The best research on Lennon's assassination is on a JFK site.
Well, it's called JFK Montreal. I don't know why he did that. But he unfortunately suspects the FBI of all of it and goes into contortions to eliminate the CIA. He believes Hoover was this mastermind of everything.
Well, that's pretty silly. I mean, usually it's going to be...
I'm trying to rush through this, Jim. So I'm sorry, but his other flaw is that he's such a rabid... I mean, we know that.
You don't have to rush. Just relax. Now, listen. It sounds to me, the CIA more likely is committing the crime, and then the FBI is covering it up. I mean, that would be the more likely role. But so if this guy is trying to dismiss, the role of the CIA in this, I find that very bothersome right on its face.
Well, he is one of these research guys who is hot to trot with a particular type of upset. He's very, very, what we would call rabid anti-Zionist. He believes that almost everything connects to Israel and or Jewish networks through the mob in the U.S. We do know of many connections that do. We know of the Meyer-Lansky group. We know of the Bronfmans here in Canada. We know about a lot of other things where there are suspicions that these people may have been involved in certain things. But he's got his bugbears, okay? He's one of those types of researchers who ends up sounding paranoiac or wrong, but his research is stunning, what he actually uncovers about the crime. So that's why I'm sending people there.
Okay.
So I have to always be aware that if I send somebody to something that's, again, ad hominems, his work on Jimi Hendrix, his work on Jim Morrison, and also on the leader of Canned Heat, his death. Stunning work in that website.
Okay, very good. He's showing
his in with stuff.
He's showing his insight and ability to analyze these cases. Very
Absolutely. Good. He goes through all kinds of records and books and who did what. But he has these things that you almost have to field through and skip over and hold your nose because they're not perfect, okay? So this fellow, JFK Montreal, has taken Bressler's book further to the actual crime scene and spoken directly about what newscasts were there, who was standing where, and so on, whereas Bressler's book is more about Chapman's movements and the YMCA and all that stuff. And that ticket, the image of the ticket, he did that figuring out. This Bressler. So anyway, Bressler couldn't conclude the case. This guy has moved it forward, and he's revealed that Jose Perdomo was also the name of a man who was involved in the CIA Operation 40 anti-Castro Cuban death squad for the Bay of Pigs and later. But it's now come out that not only was he the involved, he was the head of it. Okay, this guy named Jose Perdomo, who could have been a different Jose Perdomo, but this is the guy's name who was standing there as the doorman for Chapman, talking to Chapman about the Bay of Pigs that day, and who would have been armed, and sometimes armed guards are gotten from agencies or as mercenaries, even if the guard company doesn't know that they're planning an assassination. The guard company trusts these people to be, got them from the government, they'd be good, or they're ex-military or whatever. So this is often how this is done. Then you have this handyman who is reported several times and then dropped from most accounts of the record. So what happened was Chapman supposedly shot from Lennon's right through Lennon's left, sort of like from in front, from behind, okay,
That's
in
right.
Kennedy's case, okay?
Good.
However, there is one possibility that he could have done that, which is if Lennon had moved all the way, not 5 feet away, the way that it was claimed in the news reports from the police, like the New York Times reporting from what they were told by the police, but rather instead if Lennon was 30 or 40 feet away down by the doorway and Chapman had turned and was shooting straight forward and did catch Lennon's left there. But that's not what they claim. They claim that it was 5 feet away, roughly in front of him, mostly to Lennon's back right side.
And, of course, John was entering the building. He was following Yoko, who was ahead of him.
Right, but the issue is, was he 5 feet away? Why would the police claim that? And then suddenly there's these bullet holes in the doorway, the sticking out doorway to Chapman's right, which if John had walked 40 feet on and Chapman had turned, he could have actually done a straight shot through Chapman's left, but that's not what the police claimed, okay? Because then you would have missing bullet holes. You would have missing, if Chapman had done it to forward from John's right back, then the bullets would all be in that direction. And yet we have bullet holes through the doorway, which weren't discovered till a long time later in photographs, 40 feet down the way on Chapman's right, down the way. And that he could have gotten a shot through John on John's left if he'd done it that way, but that's not what they claim. So I'm saying there is a physical possibility he could have done that, but that's not what they're claiming. Then we have these people who got out of a cab, and that's not mentioned. We have the...
Well, did they get out of the cab, or they just drove up, they got out of the cab?
Supposedly they were standing there, they had come up in a cab, were talking, witnessed it, then got in the cab, sped away, and no more mention, okay?
That's bizarre.
None of this stuff came out in a trial, and it's almost never mentioned in any account.
Claire, have you ever seen the autopsy report on John Lennon?
The autopsy report is not open to the public. However, there was a report from a guy who did see it, and we have a death certificate, okay? So there's no autopsy report that we have. None of that could come out in the trial, but because there was no trial. But we do have the death certificate. He was shot, I think it was four times?
I think five.
Five times, mostly in the chest, but also through the subclavian artery.
But weren't these shots fired into his back?
Yeah, on the left, his left back.
So he went from the back into the chest cavity.
Yes, but the death certificate doesn't say that. The only thing that says that is the report from the guy that saw the autopsy report, okay? So John was shot several times through his left.
Boy, the cover-up here is so extensive, Claire. I mean, they're so clever. They don't have any trial. You don't have, examination evidence. You got a death certificate, but it's non-specific. You don't have access to the autopsy report.
That's right.
This is a classic kind of cover-up.
But what's stunning is if you read most talk of it, you would really almost never suspect there are any problems. It's not like with Kennedy's. It's not like even the pieces that were weird came out. You have to actually look further to even notice there's anything weird about this, and it's all weird. So I was going to talk about the bullet holes in the glass doorway.
Well, Claire, that's okay. Listen, what about the bullet holes in the glass doorway? You can go quick.
Okay. Normally, there is no structure in front of the little alcove on the right at the back of this walkway. But that day or that year, there was this doorway that stuck out. It was like a sort of little structure. It stuck out like a bay window and had a doorway that angled back and another piece of wood out, and then there was another structure behind it. We have one photo of it, and we also have a grainy image from a video that showed it, and we also have one diagram from the police that shows it and one that doesn't, all right? That doorway, which was angled back, has 2 shots in it. Now, JFK Montreal guy claims there's 3, but there is a clear photo that shows 2. So there were 2, and yes, Chapman could have turned way to his right, shot along the wall, and hit that doorway and gotten through John's back. But the clearer shot was either from the handyman who might have come out from the archway that was right across from that doorway and walked forward, passing John, spun around and shot him about 5 feet away, but from a different angle, from his left, or Perdomo, who was further down the thing and shot, and he was, of course, if he was an anti-Castro Cuban, he was an assassin, but he may very well not have been the actual shooter.
Right.
The position of JFK Montreal was to mention all this stuff about the handyman, but then focus on Perdomo. I actually think it was the handyman, whose name we don't have, and Perdomo was the arranger, and he was an assassin. So it's a little more complicated. Yeah. So anyway, Chapman ultimately believes he did it. He's been behind bars for years. We do know some shots missed. We don't know what they hit. Supposedly they hit a wall and some other things. Poor John was pretty well dead very quickly. Supposedly the shots were so good that they basically severed pretty well all around his heart, said the doctors, basically pulling up mush. They were hollow point bullets, and there may have even been more shots fired than Chapman's revolver actually had in the gun. So most people don't know this, and I wanted to bring it on in honor of John.
And I appreciate it greatly. I appreciate greatly, Claire, and I think you've done a super job. And we're going to continue our discussion with Total Info during the second hour. Meanwhile, I want to thank Clare Kuehn very much for this excellent presentation. We'll be right back.
We can now say, with moral certainty and considerable scientific authority, that the death of JFK was committed by a meticulously executed conspiracy which was obscured by an extensive cover-up. Murder in Dealey Plaza, edited by James Fetzer, goes to the heart of the JFK assassination. You'll read new and up-to-date information regarding the Secret Service, the Lincoln limousine, the medical evidence, the cover-up, altering the film, framing the patsy, and the silent historians. Also, 16 smoking guns, each one crushing the government's lone assassin scenario. A world-class chronology of November 22nd, 1963. Chapters by David W. Mantic, Gary Aguilar, Vincent Palomera, Douglas Weldon, Jack White, Ira David Wood III, James H. Fetzer, Doug Horn, and a classic essay by Bertrand Russell. The complete story in the pages of one single book, edited by James H. Fetzer. Read it now. Read it again. You'll use it as a reference. Murder in Dealey Plaza. Available at Amazon.com and major bookstores around the world. It's murder.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jim. You know, it's kind of funny. I just realized when I was looking at the calendar the other day, I said, Friday is the observance of Lenin's assassination. You should do a show on that. And then, of course, today is actually the 7th, so maybe you should have been doing a show on the Pearl Harbor conspiracy.
Well, that's okay.
Instead. But maybe next year, right?
There's a superabundance of conspiracies for us to consider, Total.
Yes.
Now, I know you have, listened to my first hour with Clare Kuehn, where she spent a fair amount of time on the physical evidence of the shooting, and I'm very glad for you to pick up anywhere you think is appropriate.
Sure. Well, I wanted to follow up on some of what Claire was saying. We talked a lot, you talked a lot about the doorman, Jose Perdomo, who comes from this Operation 40, which was the squad of ex-Cubans, anti-Castro Cubans, that was run by the CIA, and how he was kind of an operations director in that group. And of course, I think we did a 30-minute segment on this case about 2 years ago, not last year on this case, so people can check that out too, see if there's anything we missed today. Claire is talking about how there might have been a third person there, described variously as either handyman or I think the New York Times called him an elevator operator. I also wanted to say, it looks like for the time being, people can go to total411.info/labels/Beatles HTML, and they should be able to find some old articles and stuff there. Maybe we'll refer to some of them. The site's been down for several months, but I've got it temporarily backed up, and I'll post some charts and stuff about the physical evidence. So you go into this archway in the Dakota, and it goes back, a number of feet, and then towards the right in the back there's this lobby where they say Lenin staggered. In the front of the archway on the left is this kind of booth. It almost looks like an old phone booth from Doctor Who or something, but it's the guard booth, and that would have been where Jose Perdomo was stationed. And they say Chapman was to the right. Now, of course, all the bullets hit Lennon's left side. And the theory posed by Claire is that, this mysterious handyman/elevator operator who would have been in the back of the archway towards the left where the service elevator is, he might have been the real killer, and Jose Perdomo, being an operations director type, was there more to direct the operations than pull the trigger. Kind of the problem I have with that is since you have the bullet holes in the doorway, which is in the back towards the right, and I think we know, I don't think they're lying about where he was actually first shot down, because there's that blood trail which was seen by a bunch of people. So if you draw a line from where he was shot to where the bullet holes were, that line goes back to the area where Jose Perdomo was in his guard booth, and, walking up to the gate from there, that little area, not towards the back left, where this possible, kind of assassin's den to the service elevator might have been, because, any bullets that went through Lennon or missed Lennon would have hit Chapman in that case. And, of course, Chapman wasn't hit at all. So that's kind of the main problem I have with the third person, the handyman theory. Not that it's not worth considering. That's just kind of the problem I have with it. Now we're talking about the bullet holes and how the bullets supposedly went through Lennon, right? There were 3 bullet holes in the door and in the door window. 4 shots. John took 4 shots, and supposedly there were 5 shots fired by Chapman or whomever. Supposedly there are ear witnesses that back up those 5 shots, not eyewitnesses so much besides Perdomo and Chapman. So let's run those numbers. 4 bullets in Lennon's, 5 shots, 3 in the doorway. That would mean 1 missed and 2 went through Lennon and into the doorway. Now, why that doesn't add up to the Chapman story is, and I think you covered this some in the first hour, supposedly Chapman made this trip to Georgia, where he had grown up, in the months before the shooting, and got a bunch of hollow point bullets from someone down in Georgia, someone he knew from his childhood or whatever. Hollow point bullets, I believe, they're not supposed to go through and through people. They're designed to, when they hit flesh, they kind of explode in. Yeah, they expand and stay in the flesh.
Right, they flatten out so they do more damage to the muscle or bone or whatever it is they hit. You're correct. A hollow point bullet would not be expected to pass through anything substantial.
Yeah, so these hollow point bullets that Chapman made a big show of getting, don't add up to what we see at the crime scene. That would, if these were all hollow point bullets and you have 4 inside Lennon and 3 in the doorway, that that would be 7 shots right there, and we're told that there are 5. And I don't even think the gun he was supposedly using even had more than 6 chambers. So that's a big red flag there. And, of course, the autopsy itself, we don't have that. We have the police report. So there's no autopsy saying exactly what kind of bullets were in John. And the only person who could release that information would be Yoko Ono, who won't, either because she's afraid or complicit or both. So that is kind of where I wanted to follow up on the physical evidence, and I'll try to post a chart to the total411.info site. Around by the time the show gets up on the air, we're only a few hours before airtime right now. Let's see, do you remember how much y'all covered the Hinckley connections in the first hour?
Oh, don't worry about being repetitive. That's just fine, Total. I'd rather
Sure.
you be repetitive. That's actually a good thing.
Okay, it's very didactic that way, I guess. So yeah, we have Hinckley, John Hinckley Sr., the chairman of World Vision. You have Mark David Chapman joining World Vision, supposedly one of these Christian missionary groups, doing some strange things down there, going to Beirut, Lebanon, in the middle of all the hostilities that were going on at the time. But the other connection that I re-listened to the show we did a couple of years ago, the segment, we didn't really talk too much about Ketcher and the Rye.
Yes.
And how that's...
and that seems to play a role in a lot of these cases, doesn't it?
Well, definitely in the two, the Hinckley attempt on Reagan, alleged attempt on Reagan, and also Chapman and Lennon, because Chapman and Hinckley Jr. both had a copy of the book on them. And we also know that Hinckley Jr. also kind of made this pilgrimage just in the intervening 3 months between the Reagan shooting and the Lennon shooting, and actually retraced some of Chapman's steps through New York. And it's just very, very bizarre. And, supposedly I think they say he went to the same hotel or hostel where he had set up that bizarre memorial to where Chapman had set up, memorial to himself and to Lennon or whatever that was, kind of like, as Claire said, like the alleged 9/11 hijackers setting up their own little kind of like, leaving behind the Koran and all that nonsense there. So, so the question is, when we get into the mind control and the hypnosis stuff, you have this text, the J.D. Salinger text. Now, J.D. Salinger worked for Army intelligence during World War II and then kind of disappeared and became a recluse. And so, a lot of the speculation out there is that he, became involved in the MK Ultra and all the mind control stuff after having interrogated German prisoners during the war, and that's all very related. The other theory is that he actually didn't like what was going on in the intelligence community, and that's why he disappeared and became a recluse and a writer that his old, quote-unquote, friends, maybe more enemies in the agency, used his novel as a text to, embed some of these triggers, just using some of the key phrases in the book, like, John Lennon's a phony must die. And apparently he also had, he said in several interviews Chapman has that he heard this, do it, chant in his head, which finally pushed him over the edge. And the question is whether or not that was some kind of trigger that might have been played, maybe Perdomo or something had a cassette of, maybe, the Lennon track, Bring On the Lucy, and I think there's another one, Oz, where Lennon is saying, do it. So there's that aspect too. So basically what we have here, not to rehash too much, but so we have Chapman shows up. He's totally disoriented. He's acting like a zombie. We even have some of the police saying he's a zombie. Patrolman Cullen was one of them who said he acted really weird. And, sorry, I'm at the lots of work here. So, Chapman is there, and he's acting like a zombie, and Perdomo points the police towards Chapman, and, they arrest him. And first he pleads insanity, then he just changes that and pleads guilty, so there's no trial. That kind of invalidates this idea, he wanted to become famous. I mean, that would have been the greatest stage. Would have been a trial, but that never happened, of course. So there we are. As far as the physical evidence, I think that about covers it. Did you have any more questions? Where would you like me to go with this now, Jim?
Well, I think it's important that we talk about all facets. I think the audience might value a recap of your reason for excluding the handyman. Please re-sketch that for us, Total, briefly.
Well, the handyman, who is also called the elevator operator. So you go in this archway, and in the front of the archway there's a booth, and that is where Jose Perdomo, the Cuban exile, anti-Castro, Operation 40 Cuban doorman, would have been stationed at the left. Chapman supposedly waiting around at the right side of the archway where he had been earlier in the day. He got Lennon to sign Double Fantasy, and then just hung around for 5 hours while John and Yoko went to the recording studio and came back. When they get back, Yoko walks 30 feet ahead of John, so she's, not in the line of fire at all when this happens. And so John's kind of in the middle towards the front when he's shot, and I believe we know that because that's where the blood trail starts. And this supposed handyman / elevator operator would have been in kind of the door by the service elevator if he was anywhere, and that would have been towards the back left. So you have Lennon kind of in the middle towards the front, Perdomo on the front left, Chapman on the front right, the service elevator on the back left, and then the door to the lobby where the bullet holes were in the back right, if you can picture that. So kind of like a square or a rectangle with Lennon in the center towards the front, towards the entrance. Now, we have the bullet holes in the back right at the lobby, and John was hit on his left side also, so that's also very important to remember. So that points to someone on John's left, which points towards Perdomo, or possibly the handyman in the service elevator. But the problem with the service elevator as the location of the shooter is the bullets would not go to the back right door. They would go up out towards the street towards Chapman, and Chapman, of course, wasn't hit at all. And it's actually funny. I'll post this, I guess it's a diagram from the New York Daily News, from the day after, 2 days after the murder. And it's almost comical because they basically have the bullets taking a 90-degree turn. If you look at where the bullet holes ended. This
is like the magic bullet in JFK, Total.
Yeah, sure. I mean, they have a little X where Chapman was, a little X where Lennon was, and then an X where the door was, and you draw the line from Chapman to Lennon. You have to take a 90-degree right turn to get to where the bullet holes landed. So that just doesn't make any sense at all.
If John had turned one way or another, that would affect your analysis, would it not?
Well, it sure wouldn't affect the analysis of where the bullet holes ended up.
But how good a study did they do of the trajectories, right? Did they use any laser pointers to determine the origin of the bullet hole?
Well, they didn't do anything. They took his confession, and then that was it. I
mean, don't you agree that the disappearance of this handyman, the fact that we don't even know his name, is extremely suspicious? I mean, you have a world famous target who's taken out, a guy who's politically extremely significant, some prominent politicians actually fear him, and they're concerned that he might become some kind of anti-war or other kind of icon. And he's taken out. I mean, you would think this ought to have been done, of course, in a careful way, unless, of course, the local authorities were complicit, as in the case of Bobby's assassination at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, where the police took an active role in the destruction of evidence.
Sure, and, as I said, I drew the parallel to the RFK when I did the show a couple of years ago. All the bullets, none of the bullets come from the kind of hypnotized patsy. All the bullet trajectories indicate that was someone standing right behind RFK, which would have been Eugene Payne Caesar from Lockheed. In this situation, we have the situation where, any look at the trajectory of the bullets and the bullet holes doesn't indicate they come from Chapman. It indicates they come from the area where Jose Perdomo, this anti-Castro Cuban, this Operation 40 character would have been. And it's not just the doorman's name. Sorry, that is the doorman. Jose was the doorman. The elevator operator, it's not just his name that was lost. It was, Perdomo's name wasn't reported on till more than 7 years later in People magazine, of all places. There's a two-part, 2-week story about, the death of John Lennon, the day John Lennon died. And that's only where, I think at that point, only the name Jose came out, not Jose Perdomo, and then we get the whole thing later, Jose Joaquin Sanyanes Perdomo. And it wasn't until a lot of this information started flying around the internet in, I guess, 2004, 2005, that we ever saw, the media ever really acknowledged him in a major way. They flashed his picture on screen in a Dateline NBC special they did in 2005 on the 25th anniversary or observance of the killing. It's, you hear those clicks on the line? That's fun. So I've got a picture of that up at total411.info. I remember I taped that special and made a screen capture of it. So while I would like to hear more about the third person who may have been there for support, everything I've seen, including where the bullet holes ended up, does point to someone who's more in the area where Jose Perdomo would have been, more than this other person.
Well, anybody coming out of that Op 40 group, of course, would be a potential assassin, probably have killed many people, involved, even some involved in covert ops like this would have been. So he
definitely. And the other funny thing was that Frank Sturgis, who I'm sure you know of, he actually at some point was trying to tell people that Jose Perdomo had died in 1974. But that, of course, doesn't really seem to be the case because he showed up in 1980 here at the Dakota.
Yeah, well, when you say that, that's a reason for giving him an alibi, perhaps in other shootings or assassinations. And, Frank Sturgis is not going to be a reliable source. I mean, he knows a lot, but whether he's going to speak truthfully is a whole other question.
Yeah. So it gave the guy a convenient way to disappear. And so I'm going to say Sturgis misleadingly claimed Jose Joaquin Sanyanes Perdomo died of natural causes in 1974. His family wasn't even notified of his supposed death till after the funeral.
They weren't even notified of his death until after the funeral?
Yep, and like I said, he wasn't even identified by name as being at the London murder scene for 7 years after the London murder. So, there you go. So there's some books. There's a book about, you can find The Fish is Red, The Story of the Secret War Against Castro by Warren Hingle and William Turner. And here's a description of Jose Sanyanes Perdomo. He was an opportunistic little man who managed to punch a CIA meal ticket the rest of his life. When he met Frank Sturgis, he was filling a bucket of rotten eggs, which would become Operation 40, the secret police of the Cuban invasion force. The ultra-secret Operation 40 included some non-political conservative exile businessmen, but its hardcore was made up of dice players at the foot of the cross, informers, assassins for hire, and mob henchmen whose sworn goal was to make the counter-revolution safe for the comfortable ways of the old Cuba. They were the elite troops of the old guard within the exile movement, who made effective alliance with CIA right-wingers against CIA liberals, which would have been like, the big new Brzezinski and all the people in the Carter administration. Señanes Perdomo got Sturgis a CIA mail drop and gave him the right phone numbers, and Sturgis agreed to coordinate his own operations with Señanes Perdomo and work on a contract basis on special agency assignments. Perdomo had launched scores of ships and planes on clandestine raids against Cuba and had sent hundreds of men on missions from which there had been no return. There were no official missing in action reports in the secret war against Cuba. It was Perdomo's job to keep his troops, as himself, faceless. So he was, and lived up to his character references. So there you go. And I'll see if I have the story on my, I have this in front of me here, but back during the Bush administration, there was a story that came out that Porter Goss's old friend, a mysterious person named Jose, when Porter Goss was the director of the CIA for a few years during Bush, he said that there was a report, and this is posted somewhere on total411.info. By the way, the front page is a Twitter page. You can go through to that. But that Porter Goss's old friend Jose from the Cuban exile community was the new director of operations for the CIA. So that was all that was reported, that no one knew what he looked like or who he was really. And that was in USA Today, I think. So at that time, I just found that interesting. It sounded like it could be the same guy. If he was an operation director in, Operation 40, why wouldn't he be for the CIA? So he might have actually been second in command at the CIA as recently as 5 years ago.
Well, Total, would you like to... Go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, I just wanted to say another interesting story from about 5 years ago.
Well, we need to take a break right now. So, Total, hang on.
Already? Okay.
Yeah. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my special guest, the second hour, Total Info, my producer with RevereRadio.net, talking about John Lennon. We'll be right back. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, concluding my conversation with Total Info, talking about John Lennon. Total, you had another story you wanted to add.
Oh, sure. Well, I just wanted to talk about, they did this movie a few years ago. It wasn't very enlightening, really, about Mark David Chapman. And Sean Lennon, John's son, who I guess was about 5 at the time of the murder, he was given interviews, and I suppose he still thinks this, but the quote from Sean Lennon is, "Anybody who thinks that Mark Chapman was just some crazy guy who killed my dad for his personal interest is insane, I think, or very naive." And he's basically said a few times that he thinks there's some kind of government conspiracy behind the assassination of his father. And he was hanging around with one of the actresses, Lindsay Lohan, actually, from this movie they did called Chapter 27, because, of course, Catcher in the Rye only had 26 chapters, so it's a Catcher in the Rye reference. This movie about Mark David Chapman. And there's a scene in the movie where it's been widely reported, in the media that Jose Perdomo is recorded in history as telling Chapman right after the shooting, quote, "Leave, get out of here." When Chapman doesn't respond, Perdomo says, "Do you know what you've done?" And, of course, Chapman says, "I just shot John Lennon." But in the script for the movie, Perdomo's quote says, "Get out of here, just go before anyone sees you." So I just thought that was interesting, that kind of this film that Sean Lennon might have consulted on or was close to, threw in this line about Perdomo telling Chapman to take off.
Yeah, that is interesting. You don't think there's an historical basis for that?
Well, I think he probably actually would have wanted Chapman to stay and be the patsy that he wound up being.
So it might show a bit out of it. Yeah. Good point.
Yeah. So it might show a bit of maybe naivete about the whole programming aspect, or at least maybe not really the programming aspect as much as the cover-up aspect and how that would have worked. But I thought that was interesting. So what else can we talk about here? I've got a bunch of different articles here, possible talking points. I know. I guess we covered some of the FBI or the U.S. versus John Lennon, a good documentary about what was going on in the early 70s with Lennon and how he was being watched by the FBI. And I guess another issue I might have with what Claire was saying is Claire, going by the Albert Goldman book, talks about John being kind of the leader of some of the political activities going on with Jerry Rubin and whatnot at the time. But according to some of Lennon's own quotes, let's see if I can find it right here, one of the last interviews he gave here it is, in 1980, it was just days or weeks, I think, before he was killed. He reflected back on some of that, and he's asked, well, what was going on with immigration and all this stuff at the time? And Lennon said, Jerry Rubin couldn't keep his damn mouth shut as usual. He was already on the press blabbing off. Jerry told Rolling Stone there was going to be a San Diego concert with John and Yoko and their friends. Even though we had no plan of going to San Diego, the right must have been looking and said, anyone who seems powerful enough to be used by these crazy radicals is dangerous, so therefore why have him here? They're foreigners. We don't need any more freaks. We got enough of our own. I understand their feeling precisely. I don't agree with them, but I understand where they're coming from. So anyway, we learned a big lesson from the left and the middle and the right during that period. That was our education in politics. So that's just kind of a little bit more, people like Sherman Skolnick have always said that Rubin was a CIA provocateur within the leftist movement at the time. And
well, that kind of action would suggest that he might be right.
Yeah, there you go. So,
I mean, kind of baiting, setting things up so they could be knocked down. Sure. I mean, that's... Tell us more. What else have you got in the way of reports or articles?
Then we have...
you can...
Well, let's see if I have this. I don't know how much I want to talk about what was going on with Yoko and how much blame. I mean, a lot of people have a romanticized view that Yoko's put out their relationship, and other people think she was evil incarnate and a black witch, and I kind of think that they're both right.
So you have your own doubts about Yoko?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, on the one hand, you could say she did her best to keep him alive as long as she could, basically by keeping his mouth shut. Remember, Yoko, he was kind of had a very codependent personality, and we've talked about some of the shows that focus more on the whole Paul and Paul is dead thing and what was going on there, and how he was kind of afloat after the original Paul died in 1966, and he was glommed onto acid and some things, and then he basically glommed onto Yoko. Then there's about a 14, 16, 18-month period around 73, 74 where Yoko called their personal assistant, May Pang, into their office and with John and said, okay, May, you're basically John's companion, his mistress, his woman now. You two go do your thing. I have other things going on. And kind of sent them off to Los Angeles. And that's all glossed over now, but there's a book about it you can read that May Pang wrote. And it kind of ends where she says, John called Yoko, and Yoko said, oh, great way you can stop smoking. It's a hypnotist. I got it all set up. Come over. We'll go see this hypnotist, and you'll stop smoking. And then that was it.
Cigarettes.
They barely ever saw them again.
Cigarettes, of course, no doubt, for a nicotine addiction.
Yeah, nicotine addiction. So this might get into some of the other, oh boy, I don't know how much I want to get into all this, but the idea that John used doubles as security, to kind of
Did John
like
did John use doubles?
Well, they all use doubles, especially early Beatlemania. They would send out doubles and decoys when they were leaving concerts and that kind of thing to throw off the press and the fans and all that. If John had some of these pictures I see of John, even from the 70s, they look a little different, and I'm not saying I do think that, the real John Lennon was alive until 1980 and everything, but I look at particularly some of the photos from the Free John Sinclair concert, where we know that the FBI was very interested in what kind of security John Lennon and all of them had around him at that event. And if you don't know, that was a John Sinclair got, was it 10 years for having two joints? They gave him 10 for 2 is what the song goes. And there was a big Free John Sinclair concert in Michigan, and Lennon came and performed, and some other people performed, but kind of it was Lennon's presence there that was the big news. And John Sinclair actually was freed, I think within a week. So that kind of really showed the power that he had. And also when I look at some of the, I think the Tomorrow Show with, who hosted the Tomorrow Show? Do you remember that guy? Tom somebody?
Oh, Tom Snyder. Tom Snyder.
Yeah, Tom Snyder.
I used to watch that show all the time.
Sure. I'll have to watch the whole tape again and see what I think. But when I looked at some of that stills, that was kind of from the period from between when Yoko called him back to be hypnotized into not smoking and when he disappeared completely around 1975 when Sean was born. I'm not entirely sure that was John in that appearance as well. So maybe I'm getting a little off here.
No, this is fine, Cole. Yeah.
John disappeared basically for about 5 years, around 1975, when Sean was born. And there's a good book out there. It's very hard to find. I mentioned it when I was on 2 years ago. It's by Fred Seaman. I can't remember the name of the book, but it's Seaman. And he was John and Yoko's kind of personal assistant for the last couple of years, maybe, of John's life. And when he published his book, Yoko immediately sued, and eventually it was, recalled, and all the existing copies were destroyed. I got a copy off eBay several years ago, and that'd really be the only place to find it because it's not a legal book now. Supposedly, they said that he made John look bad and was liable. To me, it's only Yoko that looked bad in the book, and he talked a lot about. They went on this trip to Bermuda in 1980 without Yoko, and John started doing. He took some mushrooms and became very creative again, and started wanting to do an album. And Fred goes through all the phone calls back and forth between Bermuda and New York with Yoko, and how John wanted to do this album, and Yoko really wasn't for it. And then all of a sudden, when she couldn't talk him into not doing the album, all of a sudden she said it was going to be a John and Yoko album, and she put half of her tracks on there. And so, I think I can respect the fact that she was kind of there to handle him and make sure he didn't get too out of control on the world stage. Maybe try to make him look a little bit like a fool. I think John gave an interview about that, saying it was a good thing. And, maybe it was, saying, we have to look like the...
You think Yoko may have been some kind of op?
Sure, in a sense. I mean, she came from this banking family and all of this.
Yeah, but kids often rebel against their parents, and the way they've been brought up. I always thought Yoko was rather an independent spirit. I'm really quite surprised that she might have had a different role. You're suggesting she was there to manage.
It's kind of like you read about, was it the CIA's Congress on Cultural Freedom, and how their goal was to kind of undermine the politics in art and just kind of promote kind of silly art, like Andy Warhol, that's not overtly political. And then you look at some of the art projects Yoko was doing, there was stuff like, it was an hour-long photo of a fly on, a nude woman's shoulder or something, and, that it's not really saying anything about war and peace or anything like that, like a lot of what John was doing. But when I say to shoot some kind of op, I allow, I allow for the fact that that they had feelings for each other, that she could have loved him, because the point I'm trying to make is that if she lets John get totally out of control on the world stage, they would kill him. And that's basically what happened. So I don't want to say that Yoko set the whole thing up or anything like that, but really the song they were recording that night, the night he was killed, it was the Yoko song, and it was called Walking on Thin Ice. And you can look at the lyrics. It's what they had the tapes for, I think, with them when they came back. And, it's kind of Yoko singing to John, and it's, very true. He was walking on thin ice after he'd, come back and started giving interviews and being a little bit more political. And I think he was about to become an American citizen by this time. He had certainly been living in New York for 7 years. And he got his green card finally at some point. I think might even been before Carter, but definitely by early Carter administration, he had gotten his permanent residency card. But he was walking on thin ice, and he ultimately was kind of shut down in a very parallel operation to what happened with Reagan a few months later. And I guess I mentioned on the show a couple of years ago that, they said Hinckley Jr. had a 22, but the researcher John Judge told me personally that he watched ABC News footage, from the day of the assassination attempt on Reagan. He had seen this at the Library of Congress, and he actually saw in the raw footage a Secret Serviceman kind of grabbed this .357 Magnum, which I believe that's what they say Lennon was shot with, and placed this .22 rifle there, because the wounds that Reagan ultimately suffered were with a small projectile, probably injected by a Secret Service agent who pushed him into the car, because Reagan gave that Associated Press interview where he said, "I never felt anything until the Secret Service agent tackled me and threw me into the car."
Right.
And
right. Well, there's a huge difference. There's a huge difference between a .357 and a .22. I mean, the .357 is a monster. It would make a huge hole. A .22, obviously, very small and modest by comparison.
Sure.
But you're saying John Judd said Hinckley actually had a .357?
Yes, I believe that.
I would think
found at the same second.
I would think there would be footage that would show him with that weapon. I mean, there was a lot of coverage because it was Ronald Reagan. The newsmen were there already. The photographers, cameramen were there as he was coming out of the hotel.
Yeah, well, there isn't actually any footage of Hinckley firing anything. It was all kind of after the fact, where the cameras all turned on that. But yeah, so that's the idea.
Well, but his press secretary Brady, right?
Brady.
Yeah, was shot. And if it had been a .357, I think it would have taken his head off. I mean, he was shot in the head, was he not? I mean, he suffered brain damage. But I would think if it had been a .357,
there could be other shooters using other kind of weapons there too. We don't really know what happened there, I don't think. But yeah, so that's what I'm given to understand anyway. So it could have been someone else there shooting, another Secret Service agent who hit Brady, possibly. I'd have to look into. Have you looked into? I know he was he was paralyzed and could barely speak for the rest of his life, James Brady.
Yes, that's true.
Yes. So, it was a very serious...
It was a serious wound.
Serious injury.
But depending where he was hit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. So we have the whole kind of Bush Q faction and talked about, was it I think the last time I talked on your show, I said that Rockefeller threatened Reagan in 1980. Said, you know, you won't get on this. You're not going to get in the White House except as a tourist unless you take Bush on your ticket. I reread some of that information yesterday, and it's actually supposedly Kissinger and Ford who went up to Reagan and told him he had to put Bush on the ticket. This is all at the convention in 1980.
Kissinger and Ford?
Yeah, that comes from an old Goldwater speechwriter who was at the convention. He said they were working as agents of Rockefeller, but the two people who personally approached Ronald Reagan at the convention in 1980 were Kissinger and Gerald Ford, and said, you got to put Bush on the ticket or else, you know, you're not going to win this election. So,
I mean,
there you go.
What kind of a statement was that part about, or you're not going to win this election? Was that supposed to mean politically he wouldn't be sufficiently viable to win, or did that mean they would sabotage the election and make sure he didn't win?
Yeah, he would be sabotaged. I mean, you know, there's all kinds of ways to sabotage someone's election. I mean, who knows what kind of blackmail material the dossier could have built up on Reagan during all the years he was in Hollywood or whatever, you know, some kind of sex tape or something. I mean, you know, you don't know. There are ways to take people out and leave people into elections.
Oh, of course.
Elections. So,
no doubt about it.
And you also remember John Anderson was also in that election waiting in the wings. So I don't really know too much about him, but maybe he was kind of a backup candidate, or they would have just preferred to keep going with Carter if they had to. And, you know, he was a trilateralist just like Bush. But so you have this kind of Bush mafia getting ready for these Central American wars. You know, the SDI Star Wars. Some people point more towards that, but basically you had Lenin, who was actually entering the world again and speaking out, and you know, and at the same time you have this Bush faction coming to power in the U.S., getting ready to do all these secret wars. Not so secret. I mean, by the time Bush was president, the wars were not so secret, right? He just openly invaded Panama and kidnapped Noriega. They were a bit more secret during the Reagan administration, when Bush was, you know, supposedly the vice president, even though his good buddy Jim Baker was the head of, you know, the chief of staff for Reagan, and had been pushed his way in there. So those are some of the main points. Let's see if I can pull up anything else here to talk about.
Well, Total, I'm rather interested in how the Beatles, you know, fit into the political scheme of things. It seems to me one reason why the country welcomed them was they were such a relief and distraction from the period of grief and mourning we'd been going through following the assassination of JFK. And that there was a huge...
Sure, and they were all happy and bright, and they had a very... Their early singles, of course, had a very precise rhythm to them that...
Well, they were cheerful, wholesome. They had excellent music, great taste, complex compositions which would grow with time. And I'm just interested in what you think, you know, how they work politically in terms of this period of history of the United States through the 60s into the 70s at least.
Well... yeah, as you said, they came along after Kennedy, which was, you know, very convenient for everyone. And, you know, as we mentioned,
let me ask you
another aspect.
Total, that strikes me that you have a view about this when you say very convenient. Do you think that there was you almost suggest they were a synthetic group that were introduced politically, purposefully for that reason, when I would be inclined to think it was all very circumstantial. Do you have a reason to think what you're implying?
Well, I mean, as I said, you know, we covered this in previous shows on the Beatles and everything, but yeah, I mean, there was a certain aspect to their music, especially the rhythm and how precise it was in those early singles that helped. You know, it can help open the mind, establish new patterns. You know, there were some people worried about the rock and roll and the Beatles were a communist conspiracy. Meanwhile, in Russia, in Soviet Russia, you had them worried about how their music was a British conspiracy to undermine their morals at the same time. And I think part of what the music did is it opened people up, to new ideas, just kind of breaking the spells, whatever those spells were that were over them at the time. The question is, what comes after that? Is it the message of love that people like John and Paul actually were trying to promote, or is it just kind of clearing the decks for something like LSD? I remember you had the fake Paul McCartney promoting LSD not long after the real Paul McCartney had been taken out of the picture. And was it entirely coincidental? I don't know. You had the assassination of Kennedy during Thanksgiving, and it kind of rolled into Christmas. And then, about a month after Christmas, the Beatles pop up on the Ed Sullivan Show and start the British invasion and their big popularity. And so they come in. You had some of the drug use, some of the bad drugs like LSD, not so much the good drugs like marijuana and mushrooms, which are plants and not drugs, but these kind of German Nazi drugs like LSD being promoted by the fake Paul McCartney. And then it gets taken into them. Yoko puts him on heroin. And in the meantime, John's still trying to push this peace message, but he's, a very messed up and controlled individual and all this, but he's still pushing the peace message at the time. And, quite popular, but then he starts running into problem with American authority. He wanted to stay in New York and become an American, but, he sent back his honors to the Queen and all that. So, yeah, he was a big leader in peace and everything, but he shut up for both, for some pragmatic political reasons and also maybe some other reasons. And then, he's coming back at the same time that this Bush faction and the CIA with the Cubans and everything are getting ready to ramp up the Central American wars again. So, yeah, he was a huge leader.
Total, I want to thank you for coming on the show to discuss this. It's a fascinating case that certainly doesn't receive as much attention as it deserves. Most listeners will know, of course, that I'm a huge fan of the Beatles, and anyone who wants to might want to review my tribute to the Beatles, which you can find at our archives at radiofetzer.blogspot.com. Total, thank you so much for being here. Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, thanking my special guest, Total Info, for being here, and all of you for listening.